What if I told you that God himself once visited Abraham, but not in a vision or a dream, but in the form of 3 mysterious travelers? And what if that single visit revealed both a miracle beyond belief and a judgment that would rain down from the sky? This is the powerful, unforgettable story of Genesis, chapter 18. Imagine the scene. The desert sun burned overhead, relentlessly beating down on the plains of Mamre. The very air shimmered with heat waves, a sight familiar to anyone who has seen a land baked by intense, midday light. In this vast, quiet landscape, Abraham, now a man teetering on the edge of 100 years old, sat at the entrance of his tent. He was resting in the precious shade offered by a grove of great oak trees, a patriarch at peace in his world. But then, suddenly, everything changed. He looked up, his gaze drawn to the horizon, and what he saw made him freeze. In the distance, 3 figures appeared. They weren't struggling against the heat or kicking up dust. They were walking calmly, silently, through the blazing furnace of the desert. There was something unnatural about their movement, an effortless grace that defied the harsh environment. Not a single speck of dust seemed to rise from their feet. Their very presence felt different. It was weighty, significant, almost heavenly. For a moment, the world must have held its breath. Without a second of hesitation, a sudden surge of energy filled Abraham. This old man, who moments before was resting from the oppressive heat, moved with the speed and urgency of someone far younger. He rushed from the shade of his tent out into the sun, his focus entirely on these visitors. He didn't just greet them. He bowed low to the ground, his face touching the dusty earth in a profound act of humility and respect. "Please, my lords," he said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion and reverence, "if I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass your servant by." He didn't know who they were, not completely, but deep in his spirit, in the core of his being, he could feel it. This was no ordinary encounter. This was a divine moment. Abraham hurried back to his tent, his mind racing with the duties of a host. Hospitality in the ancient world was a sacred responsibility, and Abraham was about to offer the very best he had. "Sarah," he called out to his wife, his voice filled with urgency, "quick, prepare the finest flour, bake fresh bread for our guests." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and ran toward his herds, his sandals kicking up the dust he had just bowed in. He scanned his livestock, his eyes landing on the perfect animal. He chose the best Kafa young, tender, and prized animal and handed it to one of his servants with instructions to prepare it immediately. Soon, a feast was ready. Freshly baked bread, still warm, rich curds and cool milk, and the tender, roasted meat from the calf he had personally selected. Everything was arranged with care and honor. Abraham himself brought the food and placed it before the 3 visitors, who sat under the shade of the oak trees. Then, in a final act of profound respect, Abraham did not sit with them. He stood respectfully to the side, under the branches of the trees, watching them eat, ready to serve their every need. And somewhere in Abraham's soul, as he stood there in quiet servitude, he sensed that he wasn't just serving weary travelers, he was serving heaven itself. As the meal concluded, the atmosphere shifted from one of quiet hospitality to divine revelation. One of the visitors, the one who seemed to be the leader, spoke. His voice was calm, yet it carried an undeniable authority. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" he asked. Abraham, still standing nearby, pointed gently toward the large tent. "She is there, in the tent." Then, the visitor said something that must have felt like a lightning strike in the quiet afternoon. A promise so stunning it was almost unbelievable. "I will return to you this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Inside the tent, hidden from view by the thick fabric, Sarah was listening. Her ears caught every word, and when she heard the promise, an involuntary reaction took over. She covered her mouth, trying to stifle a laugh. But it wasn't a laugh of joy or excitement. It was the tired, cynical laugh of someone who had carried a deep disappointment for decades. A child now, at her age, and Abraham's, the very idea seemed absurd. Her laugh was the sound of a heart protecting itself, the echo of an old, deep wound resurfacing. She whispered to herself, so quietly she thought no one could hear, "After I am worn out, and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Her words were a mix of sarcasm and sorrow, but the visitor heard. He spoke again, his voice carrying clearly from outside the tent, this time addressing Abraham but loud enough for Sarah to hear every syllable. Why did Sarah laugh? The question hung in the air, gentle yet piercing. Then came the words that would echo through generations, a challenge to all human doubt. Is anything too hard for the Lord? His words cut through Sarah's disbelief like a sharp sword. The hidden laughter died in her throat, replaced by a sudden, cold fear. She knew she had been heard, not just by human ears, but by a divine presence. She cautiously stepped out from the tent, just enough to be seen and heard. "I did not laugh," she said softly, her voice weak with denial, but the visitor replied with a simple, unshakable truth. "Yes, you did." He didn't say it in anger or condemnation. He said it as a statement of fact. A truth that acknowledged her doubt, her pain, and her disbelief. But it was a truth that was about to be transformed, miraculously, into overwhelming joy. After the meal and the stunning promise, the three visitors rose to leave. Two of them turned and began walking down the hill, their path leading toward the valley where the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah lay, cities whose reputation for terrible wickedness had reached the heavens. But one of the visitors stayed behind with Abraham. It was the Lord himself, and he spoke, almost as if thinking aloud. "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" It was a rhetorical question. God chose to treat Abraham not just as a servant, but as a friend, a partner in his divine plan. He revealed to Abraham that the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah was great. Their sin was grievous, and that judgment was coming. At that moment, something incredible happened. Abraham, this humble man from the desert, drew closer. This was a moment unlike any other in history. Abraham stood before the Lord and began to intercede, to plead for an entire city filled with people he did not know. His voice was filled with a bold reverence. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" he asked. "What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you spare it for their sake?" And God, in his immense patience and mercy, answered, "If I find 50 righteous people in Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." But Abraham, emboldened by this response, pressed on. He was bargaining with God, not for himself, but for others. "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? What about 45? Each time, the Lord answered gently, patiently, "I will not destroy it if I find 45. So Abraham continued, "What about 40? What about 30? What about 20? With each question, Abraham's plea grew more desperate, and with each answer, God's mercy was revealed. Finally, Abraham reached his last number. "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 are found there?" And the Lord replied, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." After that, Abraham stopped. He had pushed as far as he dared. There was nothing more to say. The Lord turned and continued on his way, leaving Abraham standing alone on the hillside. And Abraham watched him leave, the weight of what was coming pressing down on him. That night, as Abraham stood under the vast canopy of the sky, the stars stretched across the darkness. Uncountable, they were the same stars God once pointed to when he made his covenant, saying, "So shall your descendants be." But tonight, the stars felt heavier. The silence of the desert was filled with a profound tension. A promise was on its way, a son, a miracle, a future filled with hope. Yet, at the same time, judgment was also on its way, descending toward a valley of cities lost in sin. Abraham stood at the crossroads of it, all between divine mercy and divine justice, between a personal promise and a public consequence, between heaven and earth. This is Genesis 18, a chapter where God himself pays a visit in the heat of the day, where an old woman's laugh of disbelief is met with a divine question, where judgment approaches, and where one righteous man dares to stand before God and pray for the salvation of an entire city. If you want to hear what happens next, the terrifying fate of Sodom, the dramatic rescue of Lot, and the miraculous continuation of Abraham's journey, make sure you subscribe to Voice in Christ so you never miss the next chapter of this incredible story. Thanks for watching.